about 11:30 now, about 6 miles. I just lost him. Tally ho, 12 o'clock. Keep going straight. I don't see him. Can't think so. If you get 12 o'clock down, it's really going to stop to the left. Take time, go forward straight. Okay, baby. Forward straight now. Okay, I got it. There's your settling time. Oh, return to Studio Oswald. Shooting farm, you're trying to fire.
Hello and welcome back to the Scale Building Cafe, and welcome to part 3 of the Zokei Mura F-4C Phantom. In this episode I'm going to detail how I actually put the airframe together, and bear with, it's quite a long one because it is quite a complicated model. Well, it is Zokei Mura after all. First thing was to put the cockpit in, that was glued into place with the ammo glue. Cockpit obviously is what you may have seen in part 2, and it's crucial you get this in exactly the right place. Some people have had problems with this, not quite sure what they've done. Mine fitted actually very well, so just make sure it's all lined up properly, there's nothing sticking out. The next thing was this little inlet guide thing on the back. So that was just put into place. One of the major disadvantages of the Zokei Mura kit is the fit of the tailplanes. It's very sloppy. I decided to build up with some thick plastic card a sort of mounting system which will eventually hold the tailplanes in and grip them much more tightly. That way it's much easier to paint the stabilizers, I believe they're called, actually, not, we call them tailplanes in the UK, stabilizers or stabilators. It's much easier to paint those separately and then add them at the end of the painting, the weathering. You can see what I've done here, just building it up with thick plastic card, making sure it's very robust, and that way it's going to wedge the tailplanes in together. I actually drilled and pinned them as well, and there you can see how it all works from the inside. Now gluing the fuselage halves together. I suppose you could call this the main event. As is usual for me, I use super glue, and starting at the nose, this was just added with a blade. This is the ammo, what do they call it, slow drying glue, so it gives you a little bit of time. It doesn't grab instantly, which is really good, because what you must do is play around with it and make sure the contours line up. You don't want any steps or anything. That's the advantage of using sort of traditional cement, is you do have that working time that you can play around with the join. Using this slow drying stuff, you get the same effect. Once we have it into position, then I use super glue accelerator. I just use this micro brush just that added in, and that will set the super glue. You still, even then, you've got a few seconds of working time. I tend to go back in with the super glue just over the top, just to make sure there aren't going to be any sort of gaps or divots or any imperfections. And that'll get hit with a bit of accelerator in a second, and then after it's dry, which doesn't take very long at all, we're talking about 5 seconds, you can go in and start sanding. Using Flory Models sanding sticks, this is well worn. The fit was so good, it doesn't need much, almost just polishing really. It's a very, like I say, very well worn, fine sanding stick. And just checking with my finger, making sure I can't feel anything. Wet sanding is less abrasive as well. You're going to get less scratches, or fewer scratches I should say. Get my grammar correct. And just using my finger there, just to check. And once I can't feel anything, it's in with the polisher, just to again make sure there's no scratches, and I can, you know, you see the shine in the light to see if there's any scratches. Now down the back end is really important because this is going to be natural metal, so it's absolutely vital there's no seams and the seam is actually perfect. This is the major advantage of using the super glue, is not only speed, is you will get 0 shrinkage using super glue, which means none of the risk of the dreaded ghost seams. I'm not using any pressure here. I'm just moving it backwards and forwards over the top, effectively using the weight of the sanding stick itself. I don't want to sand any divots in. The Zokei Mura plastic is actually quite soft, and it's quite easy to go too far, so I'm being very careful, and then going in with a Florey's polisher just to get rid of any potential scratches. And again, using the finger just to check the seam. Traditional glue, well, not that traditional because this is the dyed stuff, but cement on the seam behind that, that's going to be covered up by the arrestor hook. And then the same glue, just to glue in the cockpit sills. There is a little bit of play here, so it does need to be glued into place. And as you can see, I'm using various sort of pegs and tape and things, just to make sure it's not going to move. And then turning it upside down, using that really long fine brush from Ammo, you can get right up in there and actually glue the underside of the canopy sill. And also, I can glue in the other side of the cockpit. And this is the advantage of this coloured stuff, is you can see exactly where the glue's gone. It means you can be very precise and, you know, absolutely minimal wastage. It was also used on the tail fin. And I tend to use different types of glue for different types of purpose. So even here on a fuselage half, I've used super glue and now the weld action glue, and there'll be a third glue shortly, and you'll see why. So it's just the pressure was held there for a few seconds, make sure it's grabbed and it's not going to spring apart, and then just some pegs and whatnot, clamps, just to make sure it's not going to move. And then it's back to the super glue for the fuel dump bit. Right, a third type of glue now. This is the Tamiya thick stuff. It's like an acrylic resin, so it's like a traditional glue, I suppose. It's not a kind of weld action thing, but it is really quite strong, and it's really good for big parts such as this, where especially there's going to be no seam, or at least no seam visible, because it's going to get covered by that dreaded spine insert. But just using a bit of tape there just to hold things together. And then we'll just go in with a bit of tape across the back just to pull it in. And then back to the blue stuff. This is all belt and braces, just for extra strength. And there we go, all clamped up, and we'll leave that a good minimum 48, 36 hours. Probably 72 hours actually, just to go off. Now inevitably with sanding, you're going to cause a little bit of damage and eliminate some of the surface detail. So I went in with my RB Productions panel line saw, and this just acts almost as a guide then, because you can go then freehand in with the Tamiya sort of P-cutter type scriber. And again, I'm not using hardly any pressure, just the weight of the tool, and I'm just trying to be very careful and very precise. I don't want any slips. It's not a disaster if you do slip, but it means you're just going to have to go in there with a bit of filler, probably a bit of super glue, accelerator, sand it all back again, and then go back in and start all over again, which is a bit of a pain. So I just try and be very, very careful from the start. And same on the back. As I said earlier, this is absolutely crucial to get this looking perfect, because natural metal finishes are notorious for being unforgiving. So I just went in and with the sort of, what do they call it, a panel line saw or anything. The teeth on this are incredibly fine and they're not very deep. In fact, they are the depth of a typical panel line, which is brilliant because it means you can't go too far and can't go too deep. So it's the perfect tool to start things off around a contour like this freehand. Once you've done that, again, it's in with the Tamiya scriber and just a few passes just to make sure that panel line is matched with all the others in the surrounding area. And it's important that the blade is sharp. If it's not sharp, then yeah, you're going to be all over the place really. I have a stack of new blades. So once that's had a bit of a polish, it's in with an old toothbrush, get rid of the residue, and then I'll just draw in over the top with the cement, and that will just smooth everything out. This is the bit behind the cockpit, behind the Wizzo seat. That had a few aerials that needed removing. I think what Zokei Mura have done is, this is a common part and it's got every aerial from every mark on it, and the instructions just tell you to remove which ones you don't need. But it's a simple job, snip it off with some sprue cutters and then sand it away. Now this actually sat a little bit proud of the surrounding area, so I did go in and just sort of chamfer the edges, which helped blend it in. And then a little bit of a polish with the sanding sponge from Flory just to get rid of the scratches. And then that just fits in behind the cockpit like that. As you can see, it fits quite well. Now for the dreaded spine, you can see there I've actually drilled some holes so I can poke some cocktail sticks or something up underneath, but I didn't need it. The fit is pretty much perfect, so it was just sealed in with a bit of glue, but there was a hairline gap at the back that was just covered up with Mr. Surfacer and then the excess removed with a cotton bud soaked in some Mr. Hobby thinner. So the air scoops on the nose, I think pretty much every Phantom kit has moulded it exactly the same way. So a little bit of super glue first, and then I actually used the sprue attachment point there as a bit of a handle. As you can see, that's really quite neat. That means you can manipulate it, put it in exactly the right position, and then just a little bit more glue just to make sure there's not going to be any gaps. Again, you can hit that with accelerator, wait about 5 seconds, snip off the sprue attachment point, and then just go in and sand and polish and match all the contours up. And that fit was absolutely perfect. Onto the nose cone. Little bit of a wobble. Didn't fit perfectly. So I just went in a little bit of glue at the top first, and then waited a few seconds, and then just tried to seal it in with the cement. A few hairline gaps around, so eventually I did use a little bit of Mr. Surfacer. And same for the sensor thing under the nose. The fin cap. Different fin caps in the kit, obviously generic parts. The fit wasn't perfect, if I'm honest. This is not a Tamiya kit, so it was glued in place. And then we needed a little bit of filler, so just a bit of tape just to save some of the detail. And then this is Deluxe Perfect Plastic Putty, which is water based. So what I do is I apply it with the cocktail stick. I'll then leave it for a good couple of hours to go off, and then using a wet cotton bud, it's just water, we can just go in and just rub away, and it just dissolves the excess. It's absolutely brilliant for this sort of hairline gap. And you can see how quick that is. There it is with the tape removed. And just cleaning it up. And what I'll tend to do is put a smear of Mr. Surfacer over the top, because it can be a little bit porous. Now, the sanding of the seam on the front fuselage there did alter the contours, so I did have to build that up a little bit. So using Mr. Surfacer and a bit of Perfect Plastic Putty, I just restored the contour. Intakes now, they were painted white on the inside and then glued into place. The fit is not actually that positive there. It's easy to get them misaligned, so just be very careful. And obviously you are going to end up with a little bit of a seam down there. Now, I'm not entirely sure this is necessary, but I put in a smear of, again, the Deluxe Perfect Plastic Putty. And then that was sanded with various sanding sticks just to eliminate that seam. You can see there what a good job that filler does. But then how to paint them. And this is a bit unconventional, this. So using some Guns GX, I think it's 2, it's either 1 or 2, the gloss white, and a pipette, I literally poured in the neat paint down the intake. And what that'll do is give a perfectly smooth, perfectly sort of glossy, and it's not a gloss, it's a really nice smooth satin gloss. And it completely eliminates any sort of hairline seam or anything. It's really good. I've got the little tray underneath there just to catch the excess, and then when I've finished, I'll just pour that back into the pot. Now with this stuff, it's important to work quickly because it will, where it's quite thick, it will form a skin, and then you'll have problems. You can see it there getting a bit stringy at the back as it's drying. But it works a treat, that technique. Right, that was the sort of front end. This is the back end now. Gluing the burner ring onto the turbine. Not much of this is going to be seen. It is buried right down in the exhaust. That is quite a lurid green, I know, but looking at colour pictures of references, it was that colour. And the colour I used was the MRP green for Soviet sort of wheel hubs and dielectric panels and things like that. And then it had quite a heavy wash actually to dirty things up. And it's quite a nice weathered effect. Unfortunately, not much of that's going to be seen. This is the front of the engine, the first stage compressor and the stabilator blades. So those sort of two sort of fin things, they're just butt jointed on there. The instructions are quite clear where it goes, but there's no sort of witness marks or anything on that bullet fairing. but it all fits okay. And then the two engine halves just simply pop together. You can display the engine outside if you wish, but it's the bare bones. I mean, none of the gubbins, none of the accessories, gearbox, not much of the pipe work is on there. And then I just used the lower wing itself as a bit of a jig to glue the engines to the intakes to make sure they just set at the correct angle. When it came to actually glue it in, I used the Tamiya thick glue stuff. I should really remind myself what that's called. But it just, this whole assembly now just simply pops into place. The fit's really good. Yep, everything all lines up. Now for the wings. So that's the fuselage pretty much done. This is the wheel well. This was all painted and weathered on the sprues. There's this extra bit here. I don't really know why that is separate, but I'm not a kit designer. I'm sure the Zokei Mura chaps had their reasons. But that just clicks into place and then goes in onto the upper wing then. And then the upper wing halves. Again, I'm using the coloured glue. It really does mean you can be very precise with the glue application. Word of warning though, make sure you drill out the holes on the underside if you're having any of the pylons fitted. I nearly forgot. We've all been there. It's going to be an absolute mare to work out where those go otherwise. But you can see with that applicator brush how precise you can be with that glue. I'm a massive fan, massive convert. I thought it was a bit of a gimmick at first, but actually for this sort of thing, it's great. However, I did switch to the normal glue where there was going to be a visible seam. And the reason I did that is I'm still not sure whether any of sort of paint or anything is whether the dye is going to bleed through. I'm sure it won't, but I didn't want to take that risk. And there's the wings, ready to go onto the fuselage. This is a seminal point in any model kit build, and I'm happy to report that the fit is actually really quite good. It goes on at the back first, and then everything just clicks into place. The back end was prized apart and it was in with the black super glue again. Now the mating surfaces here, or rather the contours of the parts, is pretty much flat. The advantage here of super glue, why I use super glue, is obviously speed, but also I could just smear a bit of glue over the top, sand it all down straight away. And then I did add a bit of Mr. Surfacer, let that dry a good 48 hours, and then went in and sanded all that away, and the contours are actually pretty much perfect. I didn't need the Mr. Surfacer in the end. The forward part, the sparrow bays are actually really quite narrow, and they form the outside of the gear bay. And I just use a bit of tape just to hold things in position there, because there is quite a bit of play there. You've got to be careful. Again, that brush is really precise, and then I can just apply the glue, apply a bit of pressure, and then a little bit of tape just to hold it in place while the glue sets. Now there's a little bit of a gap at the wing because there's quite a bit of play actually in that fuselage. So I just wedged a scalpel down the side to eliminate that gap, and went in with the cement and just smeared it over the seam just to seal everything in. That did have a bit of Mr. Surfacer as a belt of braces approach later on, but it didn't need it, if I'm honest. And on the other side, a paintbrush was used because the gap was slightly bigger, tiny bit bigger. But that, again, did a good job of just spreading it just enough to eliminate the gap. Right, I waited almost sort of 4 or 5 days to make sure that the glue had gone absolutely rock hard here before restoring this panel line. The join is over a panel line. I did go in and sand to match the contours, which eliminated the panel line pretty much. So a little bit of Dymo tape and again, very careful use of the scriber, just restored it. And then obviously the sanding is going to get rid of any rivets, and there are rivets along the panel line. So I just went in with a Galaxy rivet tool, picked the right one. I think it was 1mm, not sure. And then very carefully, just along that panel line, freehand went in and put those rivets back in. Now it's going to be awkward with paint here when the time comes to get down in behind the intakes and splitter plates and what have you. So using, this is a mixed green because I don't have any of the correct paint out here with me, which is a bit annoying. So I mixed it up by eye, which will do a good enough job, I think. And tan on the other side. I have got that paint, so that was done on the other side. And then looking at the reference photos, there was like a band of colour on the inside, on the sort of lip of the intake. So that was just sprayed in place as well. And then once applied, we can just go in and remove the masking. And you'll see that's using the Tamiya flexible tape. How neat that is. So the splitter plate is 2 parts. Unfortunately, you can't slide it in afterwards, which is a bit of a shame. Hence why I've painted the areas. But this clicks into place. And the fit at the top and down the sides was really quite good. But I could have eliminated the gap at the bottom. But that would have meant I would have had a step. So what I did is I matched the contour at the bottom and then ended up filling that gap. It's, well, anything up to 1mm wide. And this is Mr. Hobby epoxy putty. And the reason I love this stuff is it has a plasticizer in it, which means it repels water, but it also makes it sand exactly like plastic. It's absolutely brilliant stuff. What it means is when you come to restore your detail, so your scribed lines, for example, and your rivets, normally when a scriber hits a different material, such as a filler, the filler, a lot of the fillers are kind of chalk based, if you like, and they will chip. This stuff doesn't. This stuff, it just blends in with the plastic. It's brilliant. Some people use the sprue goo, the homemade stuff, where you get a solvent, a glue, put a load of sprue in or plastic card, but that stuff will take years to proper go off, and you are pretty much guaranteed to get sink marks with that. This stuff, it dries overnight and 0 shrinkage. Obviously though, some of the panel lines need to be matched up and restored, so a bit of Dymo tape and the P-cutter thing from Tamiya was used just to restore those panel lines. Now the P-cutter thing wouldn't get right in that contour, that 90-degree join between the wing and the fuselage, so I used the trumpeter version, which gets right in there. And you can see I've cut the Dymo tape nice and thin. That's so I can get it nice and accurate and match the contour. And that was polished up. Toothbrush to remove all the sanding dust and residue. And then in with the cement just to smooth everything off and make it match all the other panel lines. Control surfaces now, flaps going in, flaps and ailerons, both 2 parts. Both fit really nicely. Using the sort of resin cement stuff for strength first, it just clicks into place. It's nice and positive. And then we just seal everything in with the thin stuff. And obviously on the inside. Right, my biggest bugbear with this kit, and that's the separate flaps and separate slats. You can deploy them down or out, but it means you have to do some surgery on the very outer wing panels, the bit that go up on the dihedral. So you have to cut those out, and then there are replacement parts to put in, and what a fudge. The contours don't quite match either, which is a bit of a shame. The moulding is very clever. It's all one piece, hollow, slide mould, blah, blah, blah. But it doesn't quite match. So I did the best I could on the top. And then any sort of gaps and stuff, I transferred to the bottom. And then it was all tied up with a bit of Mr. Surfacer. But I would have much preferred if these were integral. It's very rare to see drop slats on a Phantom on the ground. I've only ever seen it on video actually during sort of testing or doing the sort of pre-flight checks or something. I've not actually seen them at rest on the ground. I'm sure there's pictures out there, but it's very rare. And putting on the outer panels, this is the sort of iconic feature really, that and the tail planes of the F4. The fit was okay, a little bit sloppy. I do hear that the way Tamiya have done it with a little bit of the structure underneath is much more positive, means you cannot get the angle wrong, and the fit is impeccable, obviously, because it's Tamiya. And again, any hairline gap, and there was, I made sure was on the bottom, and then that was filled with Mr. Surfacer. It's really important to get the angles the same. You can see they're not there, looking straight ahead. So while the glue is still soft, little bit of tweakage. And I couldn't resist just push fitting the tail planes in, just to have a look at the iconic shape. Nearly at the end now, and the pilot's combing was painted a very dark grey and then went in with a black wash just to highlight some of the details. Eventually that was given a very subtle dry brush as well. And then the one-piece canopy was put on just for the priming. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to mask off and paint the inside of the windshield and the centre section, detail it all up, and then I'm going to mask the rest of the cockpit. I may even chop up the moving parts on this single piece as masks. I don't know yet, we'll have to see. And there is the airframe all done. That is the end of part 3. Normally I'd have a what's coming up in part 4, but I haven't done it yet. So you'll have to wait until after Ramadan. It's going to be probably 5 weeks or so. So thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you then. Bye-bye.